And welcome, everyone. Thank you guys for coming out for our final webinar of the 2025 Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism webinar series. Um, I will be talking this evening about mangroves and marsh, the habitats that make up our Florida estuaries. My name is Carolyn Kovacs. I am the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent with Flagler and Volusia counties, with UF Extension in those counties. And this is a webinar that is being put on by the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism, which was an organization that was established in Florida in 1988 to establish and maintain a professional code of ecotourism ethics in order to encourage an awareness and stewardship of Florida's natural heritage. And so Florida Sea, as we call it for short, um, you can, if anybody is a ecotourism provider, you can get certified through Florida Sea. They have a pretty rigorous standard in terms of things that they make sure that people who are certified with Florida Sea are attaining, both in terms of how they are educating folks, how they are interacting with the environment, and even, the people that they work with and the products that they use and everything else. And so it's also a great opportunity if you are traveling around the state and you want to engage in some adventures in different areas. Definitely encourage checking out their website for providers who have gone through this process because you know that they will be upholding very high standards for themselves and their organizations. And of course, we want to promote good use of our natural resources and education to visitors and residents about those and making sure that we are enjoying those places responsibly and not having any negative impact. Um, so yeah, definitely check out Florida Sea. And I am on the board along with Mike, who is joining me today and is going to help me moderate the chat, as well as Kate. And the three of us make up the education committee. So we're the ones who've been putting on the webinar series last year and this year. And we look forward to doing it again next year. We are three Florida Sea Grant Extension agents. I am again in Florida, Flagler and Volusia. Mike's down in Collier County, and Kate is in Charlotte County. And so, if you don't know your local extension office, I definitely encourage you to check out your local UF IFAS extension office. And not every county does have a Sea Grant agent, but a good chunk of the ones along the coast do. So, good to also get to know your local extension agents and your Sea Grant agents if you have one. Um, and so, like I said, this is our last one of the season. I will be asking you guys at the very end. There's a brief survey that we'd appreciate if you guys could take a couple minutes to fill out. And one of the things at the end there is if you have any suggestions for topics. So we'll be pausing on giving the presentations here for the next several months, but we'll be working on scheduling the next one. So if there's anything in particular folks want to learn about, you can always let us know during that survey. And so, without further ado, I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about estuaries and the plants that make up them up. So, I love being interactive when I'm talking to folks in person. It's a little trickier online, so I might be talking to myself a little bit more than trying to have you guys answer. But just think to yourself, do you know what an estuary is? So usually when I ask folks, I get the answer of it's where the river meets the sea. I know I've seen that on some of the educational posters that we have. Or it's where the freshwater and saltwater bodies of water mix. And that is definitely true. But something that I actually didn't realize for a while is that that's not the only type of estuary that exists. And so an estuary is just where two different bodies of water that are chemically different mix. And so you can actually have an estuary where there's two different freshwaters that are mixing. And so you have estuaries up in the Great Lakes because if you have a lake and you have a river, even if they're both fresh, they might have different chemical compositions just based on the sources of the water, what other inputs are going in there. And so you can have estuaries with just fresh water. However, I'd say the vast majority of time that we're talking about estuaries, we are referring to a freshwater and a saltwater body mixing. So we usually have our rivers that have runoff, whether they're being fed by springs, a lot of rain water, obviously from our area, and then where we have inlets where the tides are bringing in salt water from the ocean. And so we have this unique environment where we have brackish water, brackish meaning a mix between salt and fresh. So somewhere in between that 0 parts per thousand if it's freshwater and 35 parts per thousand for the seawater. We're going to be somewhere in between there. And if any of you guys have tried to grow plants and anybody lives near the coast, you probably know that a lot of plants do not like salt water. If you tried to take most of your plants that are growing in your yard and grow them in an estuary, most of them would die because a lot of plants, cannot handle the salt. It's going to affect their ability to retain their water. And so within an estuary, you have a unique set of plants. And one thing that's pretty great is it's a pretty small group of plants. So if you hang out in the estuaries, you really don't need to learn too many different types of plants because there is a small subset of ones that can handle those conditions. So some of those plants we talk about the salt marsh. So when we're talking about the salt marsh, there are a lot of different plants that could be involved in that, but the two that we primarily have here. So again, I'm based in Flagler and Volusia, so depending on where you are in the state, you might have some others that you see, more, but I think in general throughout the state of Florida, definitely my area, smooth cordgrass is our main one and black needle rush. So smooth cordgrass is also known by the scientific name Spartina alterniflora. There's several different types of Spartinas. I if we refer to this one just as Spartina a lot, even though there are a lot of other Spartinas, so it's not the only one. But sorry, I was just checking the chat. So we hear this referred to as Spartina sometimes, but the common name is smooth cordgrass. And so this is a species of grass that is emergent, meaning that it lives along the edge of the water and it actually can be in the water. This is a plant that can tolerate getting flooded pretty high. So at high tide, it can handle pretty solid inundation, but then at low tide, it's likely going to be exposed. And this is as opposed to some of the other plants that you might find in an estuary. You'll find a little bit higher up, and they can tolerate salty conditions or a little bit of water, but they're not going to want to be submerged quite as much. So that is one thing that's really important about this plant is that it can handle being submerged. And yeah, this is our most common plant that you have when we think about our salt marshes. And it has a nice bright green color to it and is going to be found right along the water's edge. As you move maybe just a little bit higher up behind the smooth cordgrass, you'll often see black needle rush or juncus. And it has its name for good reason. Black needle rush is very pointy. It has a very needle-like tip on the end. So if you're ever out amongst it, you want to be very careful. And it is a rush. So I have to admit that I'm not a huge plant person. I'm not a botanist. My plant knowledge is very much limited to plants that live near the water, near salt water in particular. So I'm good with my estuarine plants and my dune plants, but I did learn a fun little way to remember some of the types of plants when I was teaching my master naturalist class, which is sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses have nodes all the way down. So those are three different groups of plants. I'm not talking about any sedges, although you do have some. So sedges have edges, so they're like a kind of like triangle. They'll have edges on them. Rushes are round, so this is black needle rush, so it's round. So if you were to like, it's perfectly smooth round all the way. If you were to cut it, it'd be a cylinder. And then grasses have nodes all the way down. So again, our smooth cordgrass is a grass. So as the blades are coming up, the blades of grass are coming off at nodes along it. So our black needle rush is a rush, and it has that round, somewhat hollow structure, very rigid and tall. And when it's first growing, it'll be a dark green color, but then it does turn gray. And just because of the darker green and gray to it, it definitely just has a darker color in comparison. So I'll show you a picture again, and you'll see it's kind of cool once you know what's out there. If you're looking even from afar, you can notice the difference between the black needle rush and where the Spartina is because you just notice those differences in the color even from afar. And this doesn't like to be submerged as much as our smooth cordgrass. So again, you usually find it a little bit further behind the smooth cordgrass. And those are our two. Again, there's many others that you can find in amongst or maybe a little bit higher, but those are our two main marsh plants that I think of. But then where we are, we don't just have marsh, we also have mangroves, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit later on about the transition from marsh to mangrove and where they live. but I just first wanted to talk about our different species of mangroves. And something that I think is interesting about mangroves, so if you think of mangroves, again, I'm not there with you guys in person, but if you think about mangroves, the things that are important is that they are a tree, right? So mangroves are a type of tree. They're woody as opposed to our other plants that we were just looking at that are grasses and rushes. And they can tolerate salt water. That's the other important part. And they also have propagules, which we'll talk about. And propagules are seeds that have already germinated before they leave the plant. But something that's interesting about mangroves is that they are not a group of plants in terms of like a family. Like a lot of times with different types of plants, if you say, oh, this type of plant, it means that they all are related to each other. They all belong to the same genus. And that's not the same with mangroves. You'll notice as you see the scientific names, they all are different genus. And so they evolve separately and they're not all closely related. They evolve separately to have these same characteristics based on where they're adapted to live. So here again, you can see a couple of our different mangrove types that we have that I'm going to talk through. And on the left-hand side, you can see that all that salt on the leaf because all of these plants are adapted to be able to live in salty conditions. One of the other things that our mangroves, especially our black and our red, is that they have these unique roots that are allowing for oxygen uptake. So the sediment in these estuaries, you guys have probably walked around them, and at low tide, you know that low tide smell, and that's because we have a lot of anaerobic respiration going on, lots of bacteria breaking down everything in that sediment, and so it's good. It means there's a lot of life, a lot of stuff going on in that sediment, but it doesn't have very much oxygen in the sediment. And even though we think of plants as providing oxygen for us, which they do, they also need oxygen and they usually take oxygen through their roots. So if they're in this really dense sediment that doesn't have oxygen, they're not able to get that. So they've evolved to have specialized roots that help them with their oxygen exchange. And so on red mangroves, which you see on the left there, they have the prop roots that grow down. And they have little things called lenticels on them, which allow for oxygen exchange. And then your black mangroves, which you see on the right, have those nematophores, which are they look like sticks sticking back up. And so we say they're kind of like their little snorkels that also are allowing for oxygen exchange through the air since they're not going to get it through their sediment. And those roots also end up, providing some good habitat and helping create a lot of good structure and also helping with that erosion control. So that's one thing that our mangroves are known for. And here again, we see our red mangroves. So you see those prop roots that are sticking down again. Red mangroves got their name because of their reddish trunk. Not super red, but a little bit red. You can see in this picture, this was at sunset, so it's got the golden hour glow that might be helping it a little bit too, but they do have a reddish color. And like many other plants, they have tannins that they produce from the roots, from the bark, and so you can end up having dark water sometimes around mangroves. And that doesn't mean that that water is dirty. It just means that the tannins are leaching into the water and making that water a reddish color or darkish color. I think it's kind of interesting. I know at least, I'm sure they've used lots of different plants, but I know down in Panama at least they used red mangroves, the tannins, to tan leather to give it the reddish dark color when they were processing leather. So again, maybe other places in the world it's other plants, but I did think that was interesting that the tannins from the red mangroves were used for tanning. And so again, they have their prop roots. They also have these long cylindrical propagules. I'll show you the picture on the next. And they have the just bright, elongated green leaves. To me, I just say they look like, regular plant leaves, but they're just nice, pretty plant shape, green leaves. And red mangroves typically live right along the water's edge. Again, because of those prop roots, they can really grow down. Here you can see the propagule. So this is what I love on the left-hand side, you can see some of the flowers. So they flower, and then on the bottom right of that first picture, you can see a baby propagule that is starting to grow. And then it will grow long and hang and eventually fall off the plant. And remember, it's already germinated at the time that it's left the plant, so it's ready to go whenever. But it'll float along and eventually get established in the sediment. And so on the right-hand side, you can see several red mangrove propagules that got established in that sediment and have started to grow. And so you just have the plant growing straight up out of that propagule. So if you ever have the chance to be, paddling around the estuaries where there's red mangroves or on a boardwalk somewhere that you can see them, it's always fun to see what stages mangroves are in. If you can find any of the flowers or find those propagules or see any young ones that are starting to grow. Up next, we have our black mangrove. And this one has those nematophore roots. So if you think about the word nematophore, think about like pneumonia and things, it's, related to air, like when we think about our lungs. So those nematophores, again, are to allow for gas exchange. And so they're sticking up out of the sediment and they might be covered at high tide, they might be somewhat covered with water. And then at low tide, they'd be fully exposed. And that's one way that you can definitely identify them if you can see the roots. But sometimes plants are all mixed up together. Sometimes it's hard to tell which roots are coming from which plant. So if you are looking at the leaves have a little bit narrower, pointier shape. And the main thing is the front side of the leaf is very green. And then if you flip it over, the underside of the leaf has a much more subdued color. It's kind of a dull, more grayish, lighter version of the green. So that's my way to always check as I look at the front of the leaf versus the back of the leaf. And if there's a discrepancy in the color, that really helps you also know that it's a black mangrove. They also excrete salt out of their leaves. And so, it depends on if it's rained recently, but I don't know if you can see a little bit on a couple of salt crystals on this one leaf in this image, but sometimes you can see the salt crystals that it's expelled. Because again, these plants are adapted to be able to live in salty conditions, but they don't want that salt in all of their cells. So they've either adapted ways to be able to exclude the salt and be able to uptake water and not have all of the salt enter, or like the black mangroves, they do take it up, but then they're able to excrete it. They also have propagules, but they look totally different. So you can see that photo there next to the quarter. That is our black mangrove propagule, so much smaller and more of like a little, bean shape. And then you can see that the little root is already starting to pop out of there. And in my area, I find these certain times of the year, we'll find a lot of them washed up on the beaches. And that's because they've all fallen in the estuary. And then they are, gonna come out with the currents, with the river, that's coming out of the inlet, but they float, so they're floating in the ocean. And if we have a lot of wind or wave action, then they could end up washing up on the beaches, but they're not gonna grow on our beaches. But you'll see them, they'll be opened up a little bit and oftentimes have that little bit of a root already starting to grow. And our black mangroves are also the most tolerant of cooler weather. So I'll talk about our weather a little bit more. And then finally, we have our white mangrove. This one has a much rounder leaf. You can see this leaf is totally just oval shaped. Sometimes at the very top, they have a little bit of an indent. We see like a little dimple right there where the very top it goes in, but not always. Sometimes they're perfectly round as you see here. They're also, I feel like, a little bit of a brighter, lighter green, a little bit more of like a lime green color. So again, if you see the plants next to each other, you start to be able to pick up the differences in the color hue that you see. They also have two little bumps at the very base, right where the stem starts. And these are called nectaries and they're little glands. And we used to think that they were for salt excretion, but they've actually figured out that they excrete sugars. So we're always learning new things in science. And you can see their propagules on the right. They're even smaller than the black mangrove propagules. They're these little lens shapes. And in general, white mangroves tend to live a little bit higher up in elevation. They can handle getting some water and they can handle that really salty soil, but they don't like to be fully submerged like how red mangroves can be fully submerged all the time and be totally content. So those are our three species of mangroves. It's really nice because we only have three here in Florida. So you've learned them all. So next time you're out and about, you should be able to practice identifying them. If you decide to ever go visit Indonesia, good luck because there are many, many more species over there. So you can see on this map of the global mangrove diversity that there is much higher diversity over in the Indo-Pacific area. And so we just say, I had the scientific names on there, but I was just referring to them by their common names of red, white, and black. And if you went to another area in the world, you'd see probably some very similar ones, and they might still call them, their equivalent of red or black, but there might be multiple types, or it might be a different one from over here. But We only do have our three. Sometimes you also hear buttonwoods referred to as a mangrove associate, so they're not a true mangrove, but they're kind of on the border. Since the category of mangrove is a little bit of a loose term, you hear anything from the 40s to 70 different species of mangroves, just depending on who you ask and what list you see, since it's not, again, a classification of a group of it that are all related. It's based on those characteristics. And I mentioned how, red mangroves are living closest to the shoreline, and then you're going to have black mangroves that are usually behind them, and then you're going to have white mangroves the highest up. They don't like to be submerged as much. So this is the traditional zonation for mangroves. However, I will say that mangroves in Florida do not follow the rules. They do not do what we teach about in all of our science classes. And that's partially because, especially in the area that I'm in, we've had a pretty unstable mangrove population. So mangroves have come and gone multiple times. And so where we have mangroves that are now, they haven't necessarily been established there for a long time and necessarily worked out all this zonation. So in some cases, it's just where does a propagule end up? If a propagule ends up somewhere and it can grow enough and nobody's going to outcompete it, then that's where it's going to end up. So I know there's places down in New Smyrna Beach that you can kayak, and on one side right there, you'll have red, and on the other side, you'll have black, and they're both right up against the water. And there's even a few spots that you'll have white mangroves right up against the water, which is not traditionally where you'd find them. So this is, generally what you find, but we find a little bit of a mix of everything here in Florida. Um, and again, mangroves actually can live in fresh water. And so when we're doing restoration projects, there's folks in Orlando who have mangroves growing in Orlando for these projects. They have to then acclimate them before they're going to outplant them, because if you took a plant from zero salinity and put it in something of 20, 25, it would be a big shock to it. But if they acclimate it over time before, they're fine. But the thing is, again, there's so many plants that cannot live in salt water. So where we find marsh and mangroves is because there's many other plants that cannot handle those conditions. So you don't have nearly as much competition. As you move up rivers and you end up getting fresher water, there's a lot more different species of plants that can live there. And so now it's just more that they might be outcompeted. So as you're looking at this picture here, hopefully now you start to maybe pick up on some of the different plants that we just talked about, or at least some of the differences that you start to see. So again, you can see on this far lower right corner how the marsh looks a little bit darker. So darker gray, green, so that's where there's that black needle rush. As opposed to a little bit further over and closer to the water, it's a little bit brighter green, or you can see some right across the way, a little bit brighter green, and that is where we have that smooth cordgrass. Then we have some of the mangroves, and again, I know it's far out, it's kind of hard to see on some, but this big mangrove right in the middle, maybe notice that it's just really bright green, and you can also see those prop roots. So those are some red mangroves that are growing right along the water's edge. And then some of these mangroves that are in the foreground on the bottom left corner, partly I know because I've been there, but you can see that it's a little bit of a lighter color green compared to that red mangrove, and these are lots of black mangroves that are growing here a little bit further from the edge. And this is a unique location. This is in Volusia County, Spruce Creek area, and this is what we call the ecotone, where we have a mix of salt marsh and mangrove plants that are all mixed together. And if you'd been to this spot 20 years before this, it would have looked pretty different because it would have been primarily marsh and there would not have been very many mangroves and they would have been quite small. So over time, we have been seeing this migration of mangroves moving further north. And the reason is in Florida, if you go to South Florida, if any of you guys are down near Miami, you've got just mangroves. You don't have any marsh. Probably got a lot of red mangroves down there. If any of you guys are up from Jacksonville or over on the Gulf, you probably have primarily marsh. I lived in Georgia for a little while, in Savannah, Georgia, and we just have all marsh. Well, there might be a few now, but in general, there's no mangroves over there, right? And the reason is marsh can live anywhere, but marsh is going to be outcompeted by mangroves. But mangroves cannot handle the cold. It's not even like they like it hot, it's just that they can't handle the cold. And so they can actually literally handle freezing. They can't handle much below freezing, and the three different species have a different, slightly different thermal tolerance. So again, blacks are the ones that can handle the coldest. But if it's much below freezing for too long, then they will die. And so that is why, South Florida, it's not going to hit freezing down there. At least if it does, it's not lasting long. And so the mangroves are okay there, and so they're going to outcompete the marsh. But as you go further north, if we're in places that it's going to be literally freezing, then those mangroves are going to die in the winter, and that's going to keep the mangrove population down, and therefore the marsh is what you're going to see. So, folks who have been moving into Florida in the past, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, maybe even 30, what you may be seeing in areas, depending on where you are in the state, is you might have noticed a transition from marsh into mangroves. Um, but something that's interesting is if you look back in time, there's been marsh and mangrove. This transition has happened many, many times. And this is a pretty cool research paper that came out from Kavanaugh in 2019. And I thought this was pretty interesting. They went through all of the historical records. And so they went through William Bartram's journals. They went through old photos that were found. So you can see all the different types of photos and observations that were taken into consideration. And on the images on the left, this is Fort Matanzas, just south of St. Augustine. And so the photos you can see on the top, where there is top left, that it's primarily marsh. Then on the right, there are black mangroves. And so that is in 1934 in that image on the top right B, that there are mangroves. And then by C, it looks like they're gone. And then in D, in 2018, there's mangroves being back. So we have this mangrove dominated, and then it goes to salt marsh dominated, and it changes. And what's happening in these years that we have an extreme drop where it goes from mangrove dominated to salt marsh is that there were freezes. And the most recent big one you can see is in the 80s. And so if any of you guys were in Florida in the 80s, you might remember that there were many big freezes. It had a big effect on the citrus industry as well, and really took out a lot of the citrus industry in the northern part of Florida. And it also took out the mangroves. So again, in New Smyrna, if you drive over the Southern Causeway and you look at the mangroves to the south, you'll notice some in amongst the mangroves, you'll notice some sticks that are sticking up even before. And that is the remnants of the mangroves that lived there in the 80s before the freeze, and it killed all of the mangroves. So once it killed them all, then marsh is what established. And marsh came in, and the next several years, it turned into a marsh ecosystem, marsh habitats, and that's what it stayed as for a long time. But once you have marsh, those little grasses are going to do a good job of capturing those propagules that come, and they're going to capture those propagules, and then those propagules are going to start growing into mangroves. And so as long as it doesn't freeze, those mangroves are going to keep growing. So we have had this cycle, and I think as humans we tend to focus on whatever's been going on the past couple years, right? It's hard to think in these larger time scales. So with that, again, mangroves aren't new to the area. I think some folks in certain areas of Florida think, or even, oh, mangroves aren't supposed to be here. It's supposed to be marsh. But, over time, it has been both. However, one thing that is changing is that we've had fewer and fewer really cold days. So this is, and we'll either stick it if Mike might be able to stick it in the chat now, or we'll stick it in there later, and I'll also email you guys any of the links that I reference. There's a cool website, the County Level Minimum Temperature Explorer, and so you can look up. I think it's for the entire United States, and you can look at the data of what the coldest temperature was for the county. So this was just looking at Volusia, and you can see the coldest temperature over time. And, obviously it goes up and down different years, but the trend line is increasing. And along with that, they have the annual count of the number of freeze days. And so you can see the number of days that are reaching freezing, which for this, I think it's that half of the county has to be reaching freezing. So again, you could, Volusia is huge, and also depending on whether you're on the coast or inland, it can be a large difference. So there's definitely even, more local specific differences. But again, just noticing that trend of fewer and fewer freeze days. And so, with that, we have not had a big enough freeze to kill all of the mangroves since the 80s. And so, if this is continuing, we would expect to continue to see the mangroves to fill in and move further north. That being said, we could always have it's cold out there right now, right? It's not freezing, but we could always have a really extreme winter and it could end up, flipping things entirely and killing all of the mangroves. I actually attended a webinar, the Nature Coast Biological Station. They put out a great webinar series. Definitely encourage you guys to check that one out too. I checked, they hadn't posted the link to the recent one yet, but I will share it later on if I see it get posted. And there's some folks at University of Florida doing research on mangroves, and they found that in the Gulf, because they studied some of the mangroves in the Gulf, in the northern part where there's not a whole lot of mangroves right now. And then after they did their initial study, there was a freeze. So it was a great natural experiment. And the smaller mangroves actually survive better than the larger, probably partially because they're lower down, right? And so mangroves are also living near the water. Water helps retain the temperature, retain the heat. And so even if the air is freezing, depends on whether it's high tide or low tide when it's freezing, depends on how much insulation they have from that water, that they might still be able to survive. And so the smaller mangroves that were lower down or maybe insulated from that temperature change, which I thought was pretty interesting. And again, they did see those species differences as well, that the reds did not survive very well and the blacks did much better. And I think that there were just very few whites to start with in that study. So there's a lot that we're still learning, we're still seeing what's happening, but in general, mangroves are likely to continue to move on, be moving northward for right now. And mangroves and marsh are both very important. They have some differences, but they also serve a lot of the same ecosystem functions, again, just in different temperature thresholds. One of the main reasons that they're so important is that they create habitat. They create habitat for a lot of different organisms, both above and below the water. So, we've got snails that grow on our marsh plants. We've got crabs that are going to be living on the branches of the mangroves. We've got birds that are going to be up on the above ground part. And then, these red mangroves and a lot of these other plants, they're creating this underwater structure as well. So for our both recreational and commercial fishing species, as well as just fish that we want to be out there to be in the ecosystem, about 3/4 of those fish are going to spend part of their life in an estuary, and it's because there's places to hide. When you're a little fish and everybody wants to eat you, you need to have somewhere that you can hide. You can't just go straight out into the open ocean where everybody's going to get you. And so our estuaries, and in particular our mangroves, our salt marsh, and also like seagrass beds, all these things that are creating structure are really important for that. They also can really help with erosion control. I'm going to talk about living shorelines here in a moment, but they're going to help with erosion control. Anytime that you have roots, that's going to help hold sediment in place, right? And if you have a structure that's going to help absorb that wave energy as well, that's going to help prevent our shorelines from eroding in. So we really want to make sure that we have the marsh or mangroves along our shorelines to help keep them intact. They can also help protect the land from strong wave action, from storm surge. If you have mangroves along a coastline, it's going to help absorb a lot of that energy as storm surge from big storms is coming in. So it's definitely in our best interest to keep them there as well. They're also going to just help absorb, their plants. They're going to use nutrients. So if there is water running off into our estuaries, if we have a nice natural plant buffer, that's going to help slow down water. It's going to help slow down, how much sediment could run off, just how much pollution, how much nutrients in general. It's going to slow that down, and those plants will be able to utilize some of those nutrients, helping improve our water quality. And plants in general, they're all producing oxygen and they're all capturing carbon in their leaves. And all of our forests are very important for this. But they coined this blue carbon, and everything in the ocean, because our seagrass, our salt marsh, and our mangroves do a really excellent job of capturing carbon, because they're photosynthesizing, they're capturing that carbon dioxide, and then it just stays in the system. They kind of build up on themselves as opposed to it all necessarily going back into the system. But because of this, it's also important to protect these habitats, because if we go disturbing them, then we also are potentially releasing a lot of that carbon back into the system. Some threats to mangroves, and also some to marsh. Freezes are not going to be affecting marsh, but mangroves, like we said, they are affected by freezes, and that's a natural threat, but it's something that can affect them. Also, hurricanes, the mangroves do a great job of protecting land from hurricanes, but they are not immune to the effects of extremely strong wind or, sediment getting moved around. And so we definitely have seen damage to a lot of mangrove areas in Florida from hurricanes in the past. Just like anything else, water pollution, we want to make sure that we have healthy conditions. I've had folks reach out to us before being concerned about mangrove health in their area. There are mangroves naturally, just like a lot of plants, they can get like spots on them. There's a lot of different, different bacteria, fungus, things that can live on them. And a lot of times that's fine. That's just, it happens. There's a lot of stuff going out in there. They'll be okay as long as they're healthy enough. And some of the cases that we've seen where the plants seem to be being affected more were also areas where the water quality wasn't so great or there was disturbances in the area. So just like us, we get exposed to viruses, but if you have a healthy immune system, if you're feeling good, if you're, overall healthy, you're going to be okay. But if you're really stressed out, if things aren't going well, if you haven't been eating properly, you're more likely to get sick. So the same thing for plants. So they need to have those just like healthy living conditions in general. And then also development. It's my least favorite graphic of the Florida today versus the, amount of development if trends continue. But making sure that we are protecting our mangroves. Thankfully, they are protected by Florida legislature. So they were actually first protected in 1984, and then the current law that we have right now was put into effect in 1995, and that's the Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. And under that, you're not allowed to go out and just cut down mangroves. That's basically what it comes down to. So they are protected by law. They are not allowed to be cut down. Um, and so, depending on the size of your mangroves, both in terms of the height and also the amount of land that there is, they are allowed to be trimmed under riparian rights laws. So, if people have waterfront property, they are allowed to have them trimmed. But again, depends on the swath, like the width of the land that has mangroves, as well as the height of the tree, as to what height you can trim them to and who needs to do it. So if anybody has any questions about that, I'm happy to answer. But also, Florida Department of Environmental Protection are the ones who have all the specifics because sometimes it can get a little bit tricky. But sometimes folks are concerned about mangroves because like maybe they're moving in, and so you're not if mangroves are starting to move in into a property. You're not allowed to go and remove them. You're not allowed to cut them down. You are allowed to keep them trimmed to 6 feet as long as they are not more than 10 feet to start with. I would recommend keeping them natural and letting them grow as much as possible because that is how they are going to provide the most effective protection for your land from erosion and provide those ecosystem services to the full extent that they're capable. But there are these rules in place to allow for the view to stay intact. So, what are things that we can do to help protect mangrove and marshes? The main thing is to help protect the established marshes and mangroves that we have, making sure that development is happening responsibly and not affecting these ecosystems, making sure that we are, like I said, just helping keep the estuaries as healthy as possible with the water quality to as high of a standard as we can. Part of that, if you guys haven't learned about Florida-friendly landscaping, some of my colleagues at UF IFAS Extension do a lot of education about Florida-friendly landscaping, helping understand what plants we can plant so that you don't have to worry as much about watering and fertilizing because they're native plants or plants that are going to be able to just live in Florida without having to do that, trying to avoid putting more fertilizers into our ecosystem because that's just going to add nutrients that are going to fuel algae. So it's definitely something to look into. Another thing is restoration through living shorelines. And so this is not just specifically restoration of mangroves for the purpose of that, which we do in some places. I know down, especially like in the Keys, when they've been affected by hurricanes, there's been mangrove restoration. But this is looking at nature-based solutions for helping with erosion along the shoreline within estuaries. And with that, traditionally, when there's erosion along shorelines, we tend to go to a seawall or a bulkhead and just putting that concrete protection up. But as you can imagine, that really puts a stop between the water ecosystem and the land ecosystem when there's supposed to be this whole intertidal ecosystem in between. And so living shorelines are trying to utilize the natural elements that are already doing a really great job where in the places that they're allowed to thrive to protect our shorelines from erosion. And in doing so, they also usually look a lot prettier and they are going to provide habitat for wildlife as well. And so there's a wide range because it depends on what the slope of the area is, what the erosion issues are, lots of different factors as to what is going to potentially work in that area. But we do everything from, it's planting marsh grass. So this was at Gamble Rogers State Park. And this is a couple years old actually, so I need to get a new picture because it's grown. But they planted the marsh grasses there, the Spartina, and behind that there's actually a couple small mangroves that they planted further up, which are a bit larger now. And then on the left-hand side, there's these bags of oyster shell because that's another component of it as a breakwater. So now baby oysters that are little planktonic oysters that are floating around in the ecosystem will be able to land there and grow and hopefully help that build. So all of these things are natural components that are going to continue to build and to grow and to reinforce the shoreline as opposed to a solid wall that isn't going to grow over time and actually eventually becomes less stable. So we say that this appreciates in value as opposed to depreciating value because it's going to keep growing and increasing over time. So that's something definitely to check out in your area. If you hear anything about living shorelines, a lot of times these organizations have volunteers that help to create some of their oyster modules or to help them with plantings. And it's also cool to see them. There's a website, FloridaLivingShorelines.com, that has examples of different shorelines around the state. So you might see some that you're able to go visit and check out. If you live here in Volusia, Marine Discovery Center has a really great couple of different spots that you can see, as well as Riverside Conservancy. And several of our state parks also have projects. So again, Gamble Rogers, as well as Washington Oaks Garden State Park, all have some parts of living shorelines. And then another thing is that it's just great. Thank you guys for being out here tonight, just to keep learning and to share what you learn with other folks so that people understand why these plants and why these habitats are so important. Um, and if you're interested in learning more, there are the Florida Master Naturalist Program courses. So there's the Coastal Systems course that talks about all the different coastal systems in general, and we definitely talk about mangroves and amongst lots of other things. And then more specifically, the Coastal Restoration course that focuses on our marsh, mangrove, and oyster habitats and doing restoration specific to those. So that really talks about these habitats some more. And if anybody this is a little bit more of an industry course. We have to do a little bit of permitting and stuff. So it's not something you want to do unless you're really invested, but it is a great course, is the Living Shorelines course that Florida Sea Grant and partners put on. And that is partly the goal is to educate folks who work in marine construction or with environmental organizations or local governments about living shorelines and how to implement those so that we're able to use more nature-based solutions. And then, since we are with Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism, hopefully I have a couple of folks who are working in ecotourism here in the audience. And so just some things specifically we want to make sure that when we're out with groups is using designated kayak trails, boardwalks, and observation platforms so that we're not walking on any of the plants, messing with the ecosystem itself. And along with that, keeping our boats, paddles, and feet out of the vegetations, out of shallow root zones, making sure that we are leading by example and modeling good behavior, whether that's picking up litter that we see, making sure that we're not touching wildlife or sensitive habitats. And then again, even encouraging visitors to look for their local organizations. So, maybe it's encouraging folks to look at stuff in that area, or it's taking information back home with them, wherever that is, whether that's Florida or somewhere else, to get involved in whatever sort of local habitat restoration work they can find. And again, just continuing to share the information and spread awareness and appreciation for these habitats with everyone. So as my wrap up before I answer questions, I wanted to share the mangrove song. I want to say that I am giving credit to Marine Discovery Center for this because I learned it from folks from I learned it from Trey, if anybody knows Trey, um, through them. But I don't actually know the origin, and I'm not sure if they made it up or if it came from elsewhere. And I'm not going to actually sing it because that is not my forte. But this is a fun way to remember and a fun thing to share with folks. So it is. And I don't know if you guys can see me. I'll do the hand movements. Red, red, pointy head, roots that walk, that's the talk. Black, black, salt on back, roots that stand tall in the sand. White, white, few in sight, dimple, pimple, it's that simple. So, for the record, the roots that walk, that's the talk. That's talking about those prop roots that are growing down. The black, remember they have salt on their leaves, and the roots that stand tall in the sand is those nematophores sticking up. White, white, they used to say white, white, few in sight. And the last time I was with MDC, they said white, white, many in sight because we've had more and more white mangroves in our area. So I guess take that one with whatever your local situation is as to whether there's not many or many white mangroves. And that dimple, again, my photo is not the best example because that's not, but sometimes that white mangrove has a little bit of an indent at the top. And we're saying the pimple if for those little nectaries right there. So that's just a fun one. Whether you're youth or adults, it's a fun way to remember your mangroves. And I haven't looked at the chat, but I see there's several in there, so we'll get to that. And I think Mike will throw this in the chat as well, the link. If you guys could take a moment to complete the little survey there, we really appreciate that. It helps us with our end of year reporting. It helps us with knowing what all you guys are learning and who you are and what our audience is. And there is a spot in there that if you have any recommendations for topics for us to tackle next year, we're happy to take that. So with that, thank you guys again for coming. And let me see yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to get yourself off the mute if you would like to ask as well. Oh, great to see some people did the coastal systems course. That's awesome. I know there's a few master naturalists I've seen on here from previous programs, so glad to have you guys out here. And yeah, Mike put in the chat that if you're interested, if you weren't able to attend any of our presentations from earlier this year, we record them all, so they're all available on the YouTube page.
Cool. Yeah, Carolyn, we just have a comment, and I'm gonna actually stop recording right now.
Sounds good.